Who is that? Is that me? How did I get here? How did this happen? Am I dead?
Ludwig Otto Friedrich Wilhelm, otherwise known as King Ludwig, the Fairytale King, Mad King Ludwig, or the Swan King. His body was found on the 13th of June, 1886, under mysterious circumstances. Shortly before, he had been arrested and declared insane by his own government. But now, he lay dead in the water, the official cause of death, drowning. But no water was found in his lungs. A dreamer and an artist, he lived in a fairy tale kingdom where nothing was impossible. But not everyone appreciated his poetic endeavors and lack of interest in governing his kingdom. His enemies would soon depose him. But what actually happened on that dark Sunday evening? In the Swan King's own words,
I wish to remain an eternal enigma to myself and to others.
Let's go back 3 days to Thursday, the 10th of June. Neuschwanstein Castle, Ludwig's final masterpiece. Only a small fraction of its 200 rooms are complete. We will never see its final form, as the King of Swans will be dead by the end of the week. At 4 a.m. that morning, a group of men arrive at the castle with the intention of taking Ludwig into custody, under the charge of insanity. Since becoming king 22 years earlier, at the tender age of 18, he had shown little interest in his royal duties. The day-to-day politics and requirements of kingship were dull and uninteresting, but titles and power weren't. He dreamt of the glorified days of his ancestors, when kings were seen as heroes and gods. He was wholly absorbed with the concept of the absolute monarch, but that era had already passed. The time of the great monarchies of Europe was coming to an end, and his place as a constitutional monarch was merely a stepping stone to its total abandonment. Though not completely without power, his was limited, and the days of opulence and grandeur were over. He had spent much of his youth at Hohenschwangau Castle, a stone's throw away from where Neuschwanstein would one day stand. The halls and rooms were filled with paintings and tapestries, glorifying German heroes and knights. His imagination was his outlet, as his young life was filled with lessons and strenuous physical training. He was not close to his father, Maximilian II, who once replied when it was suggested he should take his son on a walk.
But what am I to say to him?
His mother was none the better, him referring to her as his predecessor's consort. He dreamt of the day he would be the Swan King, like the mythical Lohengrin, the Swan Knight, victorious against any who opposed him. The realities of governance in Bavaria were far different. The independent states of Germany were being united under Otto von Bismarck's Prussian command. A new emperor was to be chosen, and despite Ludwig's hopes, it wasn't to be him. Wilhelm I would lead the unified power, having put Bavaria in its place when they joined Austria in the war against Prussia at the beginning of Ludwig's reign. He retreated to where his true interests lied, fantasy and the arts, building or renovating 7 different castles during his reign. The 3 most well-known being Herrenchiemsee, built in the style of the Château de Versailles of his idol, Louis XIV. It was never completed. Linderhof Palace, featuring the amazing Venus Grotto, where Ludwig would enjoy boat rides at night. It was completed, as it was one of the smaller and less expensive of his ventures. And of course, Neuschwanstein Castle. Set in the mountains above his childhood home of Hohenschwangau, this was his magnum opus. A fantasy castle straight from European legends of days gone by, even though not nearly finished, it still contains opulent pieces of art and depictions of German fairy tales and legends. It is here where they came for him. His government had had enough of him. He had spent a fortune and was drowning in debt to the tune of 14 million marks, the equivalent today of 128 million US dollars. But against common belief, this wasn't Bavaria's money. They didn't come for him because he was bankrupting the kingdom. This was his own money, his family's money, and borrowed money. His debtors would come soon, however, as he had no plans nor intention on repaying these loans. Instead, he ordered his ministers to secure more funding. How and from who? He couldn't care less. Like the monarch he believed he was, he issued the command and expected it to be fulfilled without question. If not, he still retained the power to dismiss the entire cabinet and replace them with men who would. The ministers weren't to sit idly by as their king took away their positions, instead forming a plan to strike first and remove Ludwig once and for all. They couldn't just depose him though. They'd need justification and legal precedent for such a risky move. Ludwig was a dreamer, preferring to spend his time at the theater or walking under the night sky with only the stars and his visions for company. He abhorred most people, preferring the solitude of his private chambers. Even his own servants were sometimes forbidden from seeing him. He would speak to plants and paintings, spending endless hours talking to long-dead kings and mythological characters, preferring their company to other people. The few people he did get along with included his cousin, Empress Sisi of Austria. Upon his death, she said,
"The king was not mad. He was just an eccentric living in a world of dreams. They might have treated him more gently, and thus perhaps spared him so terrible an end."
The choice was clear. They would have him declared mentally ill. But how would they convince the king to allow them to examine him? They knew he would never acquiesce to such a demand. So instead they gathered evidence from servants and people who knew him, and essentially had him declared mentally unfit in absentia. This so-called medical report was created early in the year, with psychiatrists like Bernhard von Gudden, the man found beside Ludwig in the lake, leading the way. How much of the report is true? We will probably never know, but it was enough for their plan to move forward. They enlisted Ludwig's uncle, Prince Luitpold, to fill the gap the king would leave upon his arrest. Once they were ready, they presented the files to Otto von Bismarck, who declared,
"Rakings! From the king's wastepaper basket and cupboards, the ministers wish to sacrifice the king, otherwise they have no chance of saving themselves."
Nevertheless, he did not stop them from carrying out their plan. The scene was now set, and in the early hours of the 10th of June, the commission came to arrest Ludwig. Fortunately, he had been tipped off and had ordered the local police to bar them from entering. Baroness Speer von Truxas attacked the men at the gate with her umbrella, screaming and yelling at them to leave, before returning to Ludwig to tell him what was happening outside his castle walls. He took the commissioners captive, but a few hours later, his servants released them. In the meantime, his uncle Luitpold had taken over the regency and announced Ludwig suffered from paranoia. It wasn't too far-fetched to claim, as there surely was a vein of insanity running through the Wittelsbach family. His brother Otto had been benighted, intellectually ignorant, in other words, mad. Ludwig was urged to flee Bavaria or to seek support of the people, who still held him to be a good king. But his uncertainty and lack of decisiveness was to eventually remove all his options. On Friday, the 11th of June, 1886, the calm before the storm settled in. Ludwig remained within his castle walls, impotent to react to what was happening around him. His police protection was removed and instead replaced by a detachment with the instructions to keep him imprisoned within his own home. For all intents and purposes, he was now under house arrest as the conspirators moved to secure the government and place his uncle on the throne. We can only imagine the 40-year-old king pacing the hallways of Neuschwanstein or sitting at his tables, contemplating what his fate would be. Perhaps he receded into his dream world and waited to be rescued from the evildoers and false friends who had set him upon this path. By the 12th of June, all hope was lost. His stately home was now his prison. The commissioners returned shortly after midnight, and by 4 a.m. he was escorted to a waiting carriage. His destination? His summer home, Berg Castle on Lake Starnberg, then known as Lake Worm. But this wasn't to be a vacation. It was to be his own private insane asylum for the remainder of his life. He asked the psychiatrist, Gudden, as he was led into the carriage,
How can you declare me insane? After all, you have never seen or examined me before.
To which he replied,
It was unnecessary. The documentary evidence is very copious and completely substantiated. It is overwhelming.
The 13th of June, 1886, Pentecost, Whit Sunday. Gudden and Ludwig are on an afternoon stroll around the Berg Castle. They are followed by 2 attendants. Gudden later reports nothing abnormal and is optimistic about the further treatment of the king. At around 6:30 to 6:45 p.m., Ludwig requests Dr. Gudden to accompany him for another walk around the castle and to Starnberg Lake. He gladly accepts, but for whatever reason instructs the escorts.
No attendant may walk with.
This was the last time either man was seen alive. By 8 p.m., the hand returned and the search commenced. The rain had turned into a gale. The soaked and drenched staff scoured the grounds in search of the 2 men until at 10:30 they were found, some 800 meters from the castle. Both men were found face down in shallow water. Ludwig's body showed no signs of a struggle. But Gudden's showed scratch wounds to the face, a bruise by his right eye, and a torn out fingernail. Signs of strangulation were also present around the neck. They were both declared to have died by drowning, but neither had water in their lungs. The guards patrolling the nearby area claimed to have heard nothing. Ludwig's watch had stopped at 6:54 p.m., while Gudden's much later at 8:06 p.m. Had they entered the water at different times? The official report is that Ludwig tried to commit suicide in the water, but Gudden stopped him. A fight ensued and Ludwig killed Gudden. Then he took his own life. If this was true, why wasn't there any water in the king's lungs? 19th century timepieces are very weak to water and typically stop working within a minute of exposure. Yet the watch of Ludwig's apparently shows him dying over an hour before Gudden. The official story seems to break down with this evidence. The next possibility was murder escape. Ludwig was a strong swimmer. Not far from the shore of the lake were a few islands he could have easily reached. A few kilometers further away was his closest friend, Empress Sisi. Perhaps she was lending assistance with a plan to rescue him? Several boats were already in the water, potentially waiting to collect the fugitive king and whisk him away to safety. At different points along possible escape routes, there appear to have been waiting carriages. Wheel tracks nearby were found later, but why carriages would be there, other than to rescue the erstwhile king, has never been explained. Ludwig's personal fisherman, Jacob Little, made an interesting statement.
3 years after the king's death, I was made to swear an oath that I would never say certain things. Not to my wife, not on my deathbed, and not to any priest. The state has undertaken to look after my family if anything should happen to me in either peacetime or war.
Though Lidl kept his oath while alive, he left notes which were discovered after his death. He claimed he had hidden in a boat on the lake behind some bushes, waiting to take the king to safety.
As the king stepped up to his boat and put one foot in it, a shot rang out from the bank, apparently killing him on the spot, for the king fell across the bow of the boat.
This information came to light by a descendant of Lidl's in the 1960s. The diary pages were shown to a Ludwig researcher, and the handwriting compared to known writings from Lidl. They were a match. The diary was lost with the death of his descendant, but not before photographs were taken. Furthering this theory is the deathbed confession of Rudolf Mag, the doctor who inspected the king's body. He kept silent his entire life, but revealed that the official autopsy report was a lie. He had been ordered to say it was suicide, when in fact he found 2 bullet holes in the king's back, consistent with the murder theory. This document has been lost. though the official autopsy makes no mention of any bullet holes or injuries to the king, besides a small scrape on his knee. Countess Josephine von Berbner-Kaunitz presented a coat she claimed to have been worn by the king on that fateful night. In the back of the coat were 2 bullet holes, and when Ludwig was found, his jacket was not on his person. Furthermore, in 1967, a drawing was brought to an expert for appraisal. The sketch depicted 3 faces. The man in the middle was dead, with the 2 on either side of him looking on. Blood can be seen trickling forth from the man's mouth, indicating a gunshot rather than drowning. On the back of the paintings are the names S. von Lowenfeld, Ludwig's personal doctor, Ludwig II, and Hornig. It was deduced that the artist was Hermann Kaulbach. A note was found among Lowenfeld's possessions after his death, explaining what he saw that night. Once he was informed about the king's incarceration, he rushed to his side at Berg Castle. Along with him was the artist Hermann Kaulbach and 2 brothers, with the last name Hornig. It's also interesting to note that Richard Hornig, who worked in the king's stables, was also rumored to have been Ludwig's lover. They rushed after the king, but were too late, finding Dr. Gudden over the king's dead body and 2 gunshot wounds in his back. Gudden rushed at them, and the 2 brothers killed him while attempting to restrain him. Kaulbach took pencil to paper and drew out the scene. He would later also sketch the late king at his funeral. But who would have something to gain by murdering the already incarcerated king? The same people responsible for his arrest. They had him in their clutches now. Better to silence him permanently, rather than allow his supporters to rally. He was laid to rest 6 days later, a posy of white jasmine in his right hand, placed by his cousin, Empress Sisi.
He was the only person who truly understood me.
His heart was placed in a silver urn and interred next to his father's and grandfather's, as per Bavarian tradition. A cross can be seen today at the site where his body was found.
My beloved is the night.
Ludwig left a legacy of architecture and art. He was only truly happy when immersed in them. The money he spent on his ambitious constructions ultimately led to his downfall and death. However, within 2 months his castles were thrown open to the public as amusements and tours. They ended up earning the state far more than they ever cost to create. The Mad King, Fairytale King, or the King of Swans. Ludwig's tragic life was a mix of repression, solitude, and some of the most amazing art ever created. From his support of Richard Wagner to his castle-building ambitions and mysterious circumstances surrounding his death, he achieved what he always wanted.
I wish to remain an eternal enigma to myself and to others.
Please subscribe and remember to turn on the notifications if you enjoyed this video.